I made a video the other day talking about my predictions for PC handhelds in 2025, and I figured, along the same vein of that video, my predictions for emulation handhelds. So if you watched that last video, you pretty much understand what's going to be happening in this one, but for those of you who weren't there, basically I'm going to be discussing my thoughts and opinions and my predictions, emulation handhelds coming out next year, or things I hope happen in the general industry. So without further ado, let's jump right into this with my first prediction. I think we'll finally see our very first sub $100, no sale, just sub $100 device that is capable of playing GameCube and PS2 titles. Because so far, we really haven't seen that yet. The closest we generally get is anywhere between 120 to 130 bucks, excluding, buying an Android phone that's a couple years old and slapping a controller onto that, because you could do that for pretty cheap. I believe the cheapest one I've ever seen was the Retroid Pocket 4 non-Pro on sale for about $135 or something from Ambernic, around that same price point, which is the closest I've seen something capable of playing GameCube and PS2 titles the cheapest possible way. And to that point, I just hope that we see an overall decrease in prices for the high-end side of handhelds, because it's been kind of getting insane, especially with companies like Neo releasing devices upwards of $400, $500, several $100s for a device that marginally performs better than something like the Odin 2, which I define as the benchmark of the best device you could possibly buy, because it's $300, and the only difference between that one and some of the higher end devices is maybe a percentage difference in terms of overall performance, which only is really reflected in Android gaming opposed to emulation. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to buy some of those ultra high-end devices unless you're just a millionaire, I guess. Or somebody who just really likes Android gaming, but who does love Android gaming that much to spend almost several $100s on a handheld when you could just probably use your phone for the controller. Something else I predict is Ambernic slowing down on their handhelds, but I fear that might not be the case. I think what they've been doing overall is interesting, but I think it might just is at the point where it's sort of overwhelming consumers with choice. There are so many different options to go for, and they're all pretty much the same thing with only marginal differences. And it feels like every month or so there's some new device being announced, and it comes out within a week of that announcement. So it's kind of ridiculous at this point. So my prediction, Ambernic will hopefully slow down. Another thing I'm going to be predicting for next year is an increase in overall handheld availability. Essentially what that means is I'm expecting some of the bigger players out there to be making actual handhelds. Not necessarily dedicated for emulation, obviously, because the legality of that is a gray area. So I'm thinking more like the Logitech G Cloud. Though I do not like that device in particular, it does work really well as an emulation device for some people. And the idea of some of these other manufacturers making handhelds for Android devices is pretty interesting. I think Lenovo has a tablet they've released recently that is pretty powerful. If they just sort of made it just a game system, I feel like that would have done pretty well. And I would love to see all these other Android manufacturers, specifically maybe Samsung could make a decent Android gaming handheld device. It's not like they've dipped their toes into gaming before. They were one of the first devices to get Fortnite when it came to Android. Also, their gaming displays are pretty famous for how nice and top quality they are. So I don't see it as entirely out of the realm of possibility that some other, Android phone manufacturers might consider making a dedicated handheld. Red Magic has been making dedicated Android gaming phones for a long time. So is Asus. And both those companies either have their own controller dedicated to it or just an overall gaming design phone. So it's not entirely out of the realm of possibilities. I'm surprised Razer didn't really lean into that with their own Razer phone, which technically has been discontinued since then, but it was a pretty novel concept. They bought a company called Nextbit, took their design essentially, and then started producing their own phones called the Razer phone, and I think they only got like 2 or 3 of them out before they completely shuttered the project. And it was rather unfortunate because you can really see where some of their design aspects and just overall philosophy came from, leading into some other devices that eventually got made after the fact. Namely being the Razer Edge. It is essentially a phone in terms of its overall form factor, and even to the point where it uses the Razer Kishi V2, essentially a gaming controller for phones, but it's in this case being more well integrated into a gaming Android tablet situation. So I think Razer actually might be sort of dipping their toes into making a dedicated all one piece Android gaming device, because technically they do have an Android gaming device in the Razer Edge, but I want it to be one uniform piece, not a telescoping controller attached to a tablet, which is essentially what the Razer Edge is. This next one isn't necessarily a prediction, just something that I hope happens, and it's not based on any just actual research or anything like that. There's just something I desperately want, is that Nintendo to stop being so mean about emulators. I know it's completely impractical, but if they just simply made their games more available, excluding the Switch because that is an actively selling product, so I kind of understand why they are so aggressive. But shutting down the 3DS emulator Citra was just really disappointing because it's a great emulator and they are not actively selling 3DS games anymore. So I feel like it's pretty fair game for people to, go and emulate the systems, because there is no other way outside of finding old and used copies of these games at potentially incredibly high markups. So while I don't necessarily expect Nintendo to ease up on emulation, I hope that they make their games more available so people don't have to emulate as their only option for these games. That's the primary reason why I emulate a bunch of GameCube and PS2 games. Just those games are getting incredibly expensive to get your hands on, and the only practical way to play them is through an emulator. Simply, if Nintendo made those games more available on their systems, people will less likely feel the urge to emulate them or pirate them or anything like that, because it's just easier to buy it or download it through Switch Online or through the eShop on their Switch than it is to go onto their computer, download files from a sketchy website, struggle to set up an emulator potentially, and have to go through the just over trial and error of making sure they can get the game to run correctly, which, again, the process has gotten a lot easier, but just to the average consumer, that is a lot of steps to go through just to play a single game. If opposed to the alternative where you could just download it off the eShop, that would be significantly preferable, and sure, they'd have to pay money for that convenience, but many people would. Well, that's it for this video. I am really interested to hear what your guys' predictions are. Are there any other devices out there that you're anticipating to come out next year? What do you expect to happen in the overall, PC and Android emulation scenes for next year? I would love to hear what you guys think about this down below. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. All the other social media garbage down below. And don't forget, last but not least, have a wonderful day.